Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Adrian and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This session is actually next in our series of K-Scope 17 presentation, and it's brought to you proudly by INSOM. During this presentation, please feel free to send us your questions and we'll try to get them answered as soon as we can. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker, Jorge Rimblas. Jorge is a senior consultant at INSOM. He's an Oracle ace and a very seasoned speaker. And today he'll be sharing with us on how we can use KnockoutJS in Oracle Application Express applications. Jorge, please take it away.
Thank you, Adrian, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to share this knowledge with you. I think this is a very exciting technology, and we got a lot to cover. So I'm going to get right into it, and Adrian will be helping us with your questions. Feel free to ask all throughout, or wait till the end as you see, please. My name is Jorge Rimblas, and you can find me on Twitter at @Rimblas. You probably joined this webinar because you saw some of it on Twitter. There's lots of really great Apex information in there. I have a blog that you can find at rimblas.com/blog. And I've been doing Oracle for a long time, and started with Apex all the way back when it was known as HTMLDB. And that's all we're going to say for now. And INSOM, we're, I think I got to update this. Now I think we're 15 years old, and we're a growing consulting firm. As you know, we specialize on Apex. We've been doing Apex solutions for a long time. And we have a nice big center of excellence in Montreal, where we have a lot of developers and we do a lot of work. So let us know if you need any help, and we'll get started with the core of this. So the start of the moment for this presentation is KnockoutJS. Here's our agenda. Why Knockout? What is it? We're going to cover a concept called data binding, and then the very exciting two-way data binding, which is really what makes this very interesting, and then how we can use this with Apex. And then we'll cover some more examples. There's going to be a lot of code here, a lot of demos. The code is not that complicated, but I'll be showing you something, and then if you could imagine how it looks, and then you'll be saying at the end, I gotta get me some of that. And then there'll be some questions. So pretty much that's how technologies demos go nowadays. So Knockout, it has a very solid track record. It's used as the base library for OracleJET. I think many of you have heard of OracleJET. It's a very exciting web framework. And it's a collection of libraries that together they help us with UI design at an enterprise level. And what makes OracleJET possible and so exciting is some of the functionality that it implements thanks to Knockout. So if you're interested in OracleJET, by understanding Knockout, you'll be able to use it a lot better. Also, in the latest version of Apex, we have charts that are implemented with OracleJET. So if you want to implement some functionality that is out of the box, that is not provided out of the box, you're probably going to have to understand how OracleJET works so you can apply it. And we're going to do that by understanding how Knockout works. The other interesting element is Microsoft Azure. It turns out that the portal component of Microsoft Azure is a very large Knockout application. The whole portal is developed with Knockout. And not only that, the creator of Knockout, he happens to work for Microsoft and be on that team. But what's interesting though is the team decided to use Knockout, and then they managed to get the creator of Knockout to be transferred to their team and work with them. So it wasn't like he was in the team and said, hey, I created this thing, let's use it. It was the other way around. They truly decided they wanted to use it. So I wanted to use this opportunity to have Oracle and Microsoft in the same slide and say that they have something in common. It's not every day you get to do that. It has a very solid track record. It's been using for a long time. And also, we got to keep in mind that Knockout is a library, is not a framework. So being a library is similar to how jQuery is a library. And this is good news for Apex because we can just add Knockout as an extra file to our applications and we can start using it. I like to say that Knockout makes our applications more dynamic than dynamic actions. I know you can't read this list, you're not supposed to, but many of you may have built applications that have a dynamic action section that kind of looks like this. You have page loads and change and lots of click events and after refresh and all sorts of things, right? Well, I think that at some point there's certain functionality that maybe Knockout could take over and could help us with that. So what is Knockout? I'm taking this directly from the KnockoutJS.com website. They say, Knockout is a JavaScript library that helps you create rich, responsive display and editor user interfaces with a clean underlying data model. I think this is really interesting. Let's break it down because you read this, it's a little abstract. So first, it is a JavaScript library, so great, we understand that part. Then I think it's very interesting they chose to say display and editor. You can use Knockout to display information, but also to edit information. So that's another key component, right? And that's where that two-way data binding could come in. You can input and you can take information. But then, as Oracle developers, as I'm assuming many of you are in some capacity, when we hear data model, we really think databases, but this is the JavaScript world. So this underlying data model is a little bit of a different concept than what we're used to. So hopefully we'll make that clear as we go along. There are 4 elements that Knockout provides for us. The declarative bindings, automatic UI refresh, dependency tracking, and templating. We're going to cover the first 2 the most. What are the declarative bindings? What is the automatic UI refresh? And a little bit of dependency tracking. Templating, we're going to mention it, but it's a little bit of out of the scope of what we're going to cover right now. But we'll talk what that's about. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cough. Declarative bindings. Well, we all recognize a select statement like this, right? And in this select statement, we have a bind variable. And you know that the power of a bind variable in the Oracle database is that we can plug in different values in here and get different results, but our statement doesn't change. In a similar fashion, this would be how we can do that data binding in Knockout. We're going to specify a data bind attribute on some HTML element, right? So span is an HTML element. We have a data bind attribute. And then inside the data bind attribute, there's going to be different binding components or commands that tell Knockout what to do. In this case, we're going to say treat it as a text and use the empno bind value. So what this will do is that as we specify different values for employee number, those values will be placed here inside the span. So if we have a JavaScript view model that looks like this, let's just imagine this function. Our function is employee, and it has an attribute of empno, and we have a number. If we do that, this empno will join, and let me get back, this empno will join with this value, and this 7839 would be placed in the span element. Okay, so that's the first concept we can understand of Knockout doing a data binding. And we are not restricted to a single element. Just like in a table, we may have many columns. In our view model, we can have many columns. In this case, I have 4 attributes. but I am not using the salary one, right? Salary is not included in our spans, and that's perfectly okay, right? In our span, our HTML is using emp number, employee name, and job. And it's going to get the values out of these values that we're defining in the view model, in the JavaScript view model. So far with me? This is a full knockout example, except for the HTML. So let's imagine we take this HTML that does something, right? Display some data. This would be all of the JavaScript you need to write. There's a function that defines our data model. Here's our data. So we have that function. That function, we create what in Knockout we call a view model by doing a new command. So then we have a new model. And then apply bindings would be the method in Knockout that makes everything run. Knockout, once it's defined, it's just named with the KO variable. So KO would be knockout. We do KO.apply bindings. And when you do that, Knockout starts running. And it will grab this view model. It will search our HTML, all of our page, and it will do the bindings. It will look for those data bind commands that we're talking about, these data bind commands, and we'll see, can I bind job to the view model? Can I bind ename? Can I bind employee number? And it will try to bind them all. And if you were to specify a name that doesn't exist, you will get an error. If you try to do a data bind for an attribute that does not exist in a view model, you will receive an error from Knockout saying that it cannot find the binding. So let's look at some better examples now. Something functional. I'm switching to this other page. This is a live breadboard, if you will, for running Knockout. Let me explain how this works. In this section, I can specify HTML, and when I type anything new, you can see how it's being reflected here in the results. And that is not a Knockout thing. This is just this page. Whenever I type something, it kind of reruns and it applies whatever I'm running to this side. Okay? And the bottom is our JavaScript code. So here's the example I was given, right? The employee number with these values, king, president, and so on. We create our view model, and then we apply bindings. The moment we apply bindings, that's when we get this end result. We get this span elements. If I inspect these, I'm going to make this a little bit larger so you can see it. You can see there the data bind with employee number and how that number and that name are being placed right in the middle of the span. That is what that data bind does for us. It will find the values, it will find the bindings, and it will inject the values. Everybody with me? Very simple example. If I were to comment out the apply bindings, nothing will come out. But if I inspect this, our spans are still there. Let's see if I can find them. There they are. Our spans are still there, but they're exactly the way I typed them. No values are being applied to them. All right. So this is not particularly exciting yet. This is just a display-only example. So let's look at another one. All right, now we are doing binds with span elements. So we get the display-only elements. Then I have a horizontal ruler HTML tag there for the line. And then I have text inputs. And it's the same example as before, right? We're applying the values. But we haven't talked about the two-way data binding yet. So if I were to change this name to Adrian, this didn't change, and this Adrian value didn't go anywhere, because all that happened is Knockout saw the binding and it applied the value one time. That's it. Okay. But an interesting concept here is that we're reusing empno multiple times, and that's valid. It's just being displayed. So if we make changes here, so I'm gonna say here JSON, then we get the names to apply here. Oops, multiple times. Now they appeared multiple times because, again, I said when I change any of the code here, this reruns. So it wasn't really Knockout doing it both times. It's just I'm just rerunning the code. Knockout starts maintaining a data model of what's represented. So here's the same example. We create the new, we do the view model, but I've added this new tag, this pre-tag that renders nicely this code here on the side. And what this is giving us is a representation of a JSON representation of the data model of how it works. So, but I'm introducing now a new thing here, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. But let me show you what happens. If I change this employee number to 11111, we can see it changing here and here and here, right? It's just being applied everywhere. But if I change this text box to 22222, it doesn't get changed back here for the same reasons we talked before, right? It's just a one-way binding. But the observable, that's KO observable is when we tell Knockout observe the changes to this variable. This is the two-way data binding. So if I change King and I start typing something, and when I tab out of this field, this will change and this will change. There. See, when I tabbed, Adrian got placed up here and it got placed here. I can type Jorge, and when I tab out, it gets placed. That is Knockout observing the values on ename and propagating those changes to whatever ename is reflected. Now, I'm using value here. Let me see. Yeah, I'm using value, but now let's switch the same example, but instead of value, we're going to use a different binding called text input. Text input is interesting in that whenever I type something, it reflects immediately. I don't have to get out of the field. I don't have to change the focus. So as I type, changes happen. And because now I applied observables to these three values, now I can change and say clerk. Now I can say here and put Adrian, and I can say host, right? And as I change the values, this one, guess what? Why isn't this one changing up here and over here? It's not changing because we did not make that an observable, but we could. Let's just change our code. I'm going to make it, oops, I didn't copy correctly. I'm going to copy this. Oh, my copy is not working. Okay, observable. There. So now that it's an observable, now I can change the number and it gets reflected on all the fields that use it. Questions so far? This is pretty cool, right? Let's go back to these slides and talk about this automatic UI refresh, right? So that's what we've been seeing in these examples. We have some JavaScript, we apply the bindings, and then whenever there's changes, Knockout is listening for changes, and they're going to go back and forth between the JavaScript side and the Apex page. So two-way data binding. We specified that with observables. But there's also something called an observable array. Sometimes observing a single value is not that practical. What if we don't really know how many values? Maybe the user's adding multiple elements. In those cases, we can use what's called an observable array. So it's an array of observable elements. Let's go to one more example here. I'm starting to parameterize our JavaScript so that it becomes more useful, because right now we've been hard coding everything. So imagine that we can create a JSON structure and we specify our data, and that JSON variable gets passed right here when I create the new model, right? When I create my new employee model, and here's the employee model, okay? My function employee model will receive some data. In the data, I'm going to parse out the employee number, I'm going to parse out the name, the job, and the salary, and I'm mapping them to my values, okay? I create my new model, passing my JSON data, and then I apply my bindings. This is exactly the same example we had before, right? So I can do Adrian, and it's all changing, and we can change the values, all right? Now, what's interesting about this is that we know how to generate JSON from the database. We could use the package called Apex JSON. We can select JSON in 12c. We can select it from the database. So there's multiple ways we can create JSON, right? And then this doesn't have to be hard-coded. We can generate this in the background and then pass it. So in a more Apex-like example, imagine that we have our view model this way, and then we have an Apex server process that generates your JSON data. You pass your some value for your employee number that you're fetching, and on success, you create your new model and you apply your bindings. So this would be something that we could run on the Apex side. All right. Next example. Now imagine we're adding two numbers. So we're going to start covering what's called dependency tracking. So in dependency tracking, Knockout can see, is there a value that is dependent on others? So for example, we're going to have a total that is made out of the sum of value 1 and value 2. So you know how JavaScript is with numbers, right? So we take our value 1, we make it a number with parse int, we add it to value 2, and then we return that to total. And this we're using the computed command in Knockout. So we're saying total is computed, and how is it computed? Knockout knows that whenever value 1 or value 2 changes, it has to change total. That's the dependency tracking. It's going to be smart enough to do that. So let's look at that example here first. So we have value 1, value 2, and then we have a display value for total. Here's our display as a span. We have the total. And then we have that JSON representation of everything that Knockout knows. And we have value 1 as an observable. We started at 0. Value 2 as an observable. And we have the total that is parsing the values. So as you would expect, as I type something, and you see if it's not a number, that's a JavaScript error, right? We're getting the not a number there. But as I type values, that is getting computed. That's it. And this is all the code that it takes. I don't know if I've been clear enough on that. This is all of the JavaScript code you're required to do this functionality. Some of you already are thinking, how would you do this in a jQuery world, the way we've been doing with Apex for so long, right? You would do change events on this field, a change event on this field, then you would, when it changes, you would compute the total, then you have to find, via selector, you would find your total span, and then you would inject a new value, right? It's a lot more code, and it's a little more complex, it's a little more obtuse or a little more confusing, if you will. Even though we've been doing it for a while, you can probably appreciate that the fact that you can define your variables and define the relationship between them is that easy. So what if you want to multiply them? I'm going to change this to multiplication, and I'm going to say I'm going to say 10 times 5. There we go. We get a 50. That easy, right? I just have to change the operation. And we can add, let's add new values. I'm going to add a 3. I'm going to make this a plus. And I'm going to add another parse int here. I'm not even going to format this. 2 and 3. So let's see, did I make a mistake here? Yep, sure enough, there it is. We close up parentheses. All right, so now I'm adding 3 values. That quickly I can scale for 3 values. 1, 2, and I don't have the third displayed, so let's just add our HTML here to add our third value. So now I can do 1, 2, 3. There you go. That quickly we modify the code and we expand for extra ones. But you can see how this may not expand in some cases, and that's where instead of having going through each one, we could have an array of values and loop through the array and add them all up. So that's where we're getting here. Now we have days of the week. Let's imagine we're adding the days of the week, and I'm going to say I'm working 8. Let's say this is the time entry system, and we're working 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours, 8, and 8. And why is this total not represented correctly? Oh, because I did not add all the other days here, right? So let's say I'm going to start. That's what I meant. We may want to start looping through things. I'm going to do a plus. I'm going to, I just can't, I don't know what's going on with my copy paste today. I'm going to select this. Okay, that worked. 3. So let's 8, 8, 8. There. So now we have the third day being added. Okay. So a better approach would be to have these days be an observable array, and then we loop through the array and we add all the elements in the array, right? That would be a fun way to do this. Let me see. We're going to talk about the array in a second. Yeah, let's look at the array example. Here's an array example. Let's break it down. First, I'm saying how many elements I have in my array with an attribute called count. So I start with 1 element. That's why it says 1. Let me run this example so you can see what we're doing. As we click add, it's just adding elements, and the elements getting changed. And every time I click add, I add a new element to the list. So how is this? We have a new binding here called for each. So it's going to loop through my array of items. And for each one, it's going to add a new LI element, a new list element with whatever data is inside the items. My items are an observable array. We start with the word 1. That's why this first one said 1. Count is a computed attribute that is simply for my items, and notice that I have to call this as a function because it's an observable. Observables are functions. So I call it as a function. Now I have the array and I can see the length. What is the length of this array? So now I know, and I'm using that up here for the count. Then the button, it's a click binding with a function called add item. And if you look at add item, it's a function inside a view model, and all it does is push new into the array. That's why I'm getting new every time. That makes sense? Let's reset this again. Just make a change and it resets. And I click add. And every time I click add, this is all the code it takes. The count gets automatically updated. The every time an item gets pushed, Knockout re-renders the list with the for each. And also, let me tell you something. It's not, let me inspect this and show you. It is not repainting the full list. So here's one list element. And if I click add, you can see the ones that flash, right? The console is showing me that the span flashes because it changes, and the new LI gets added. I'm going to click.
Hi everyone, sorry about this. It seems like we're having some technical difficulties. I'm trying to reach out to Jorge to see if what's happening on this end. We'll be back to you shortly.
Hello guys, we lost connection for a while. I'm sorry. Adrian, can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you loud and clear. Thanks.
How much did we lose?
Probably about 30 to 45 seconds, one slide, thereabouts.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened here. Some network connectivity problems. So I was saying that this example is the same one as before when we add the multiple elements, but now we're going to implement a business rule where we don't want to add elements forever. So we're adding this function called can add items. That's basically going to say if the length is less than 5, it's going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. And I'm using a new binding here. The only thing that's different now in this example is in the HTML is this enable. So enable is going to run this can add items, and if it's true, the button is enabled. If it's false, it gets disabled. So look at this. I get to 4, 5. When I get to 5, I don't know if you saw it, but that button got grayed out. I'm going to reset this. Watch it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it gets grayed out because this enable attribute. And there's more interesting bindings too. For example, I'm going to add another binding called CSS. And in the CSS, I'm going to add a CSS class. Now, my page has a class called error. Okay, in this page that already exists, and it's just the color red. And I'm going to say can add items. Okay, so right now it's red because I can add them, but I'm going to say when I cannot add items, I'm going to switch it to red. So I'm going to do the 5, and there you can see how it's red. Well, I lose it on hover. So because I lose it on hover, how about we do this? I'm going to grab this and I'm going to add it to my text. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There you go, and it turns red. You see how easy we implemented that business rule here? Just adding some CSS, the enable, disable, calling a JavaScript function. So not a complicated thing to read and follow in our code. And again, it's thanks to a computed value that automatically switches to between true and false when we go past our arbitrary limit here. There's another very interesting functionality called subscriptions. We can subscribe to the changes of something. So let's say that whenever the value, we have a value attribute, whenever the value attribute changes, we want to do something, maybe save it to the database. We're going to subscribe to changes of value. You can do all sorts of things, but in this case, I'm saying whenever value changes, I'm going to call a function called save value. Save value could be a function that calls Apex server process. And it could do an AJAX call to send our values over to the database, or validate them, or do whatever we need. So subscriptions can be very interesting here.
Jorge, we're not hearing you again.
Okay, are we back? Sorry
Yep, we
about
can
that.
hear.
I don't know why we're losing the network here. I'm sorry. So we're specifying here the template. We do a data bind with the template, and we give that template a name, person list template, and we can pass some data to that. And then the template, this template, we could also make it a function, so we can find different templates. So let me give you an example of a template. So the template could be a list. We can specify with a special script tag, we can inject a template into the page. This is the name of the template. So this alone doesn't do anything. We got to use it. And this could be a different type of template in which we maybe present the data with a full table where we have the name and salary, where in this one we just have the names. So these two templates could use exactly the same data. They could both operate on the people array. See how we have here for each people. So the people array could have name and salary, and maybe in a different template we may just want to display it as name. And here's how we just specify where our data is. We just say, well, use this template or use a different template. All right, let's get to some fun examples inside of Apex. All right, finally, some Apex. So here we have a universal theme app. We have two plain text boxes in Apex. Let me see if I can still edit this page. Great, I'm not logged out, so while that page loads, what is this? This is our sum example where I enter a 1 and a 2, and we sum the two values. We can have 10 and 100, 120, 125, right? So what are we doing? These are standard Apex items. If we go to the page, you're going to see that we have standard Apex items, value 1, value 2. Great. There you go. Value 1 and value 2, and we have a total. What are these val bindings? That is just me saying, show me the bindings. So these are the bind items. They're just for display purposes. I'm just showing you what binding I'm applying to this element. And I'm applying the text input binding to value 1. So what is this page doing? On the top of the page, I included Knockout because this is Apex 5.1. Remember, I mentioned that it comes with OracleJET. So Knockout is already in your server inside the OracleJET directory. So if you do this include, you get to start using Knockout. If you're in Apex 5, Apex 4, 4.2, 4.1, it doesn't really matter. You just have to upload the library yourself and include it in your page. That's all it takes. It really doesn't matter what version of Apex you're in. You can always use Knockout. So I include Knockout, and then here's my view model in which I define value 1 and value 2. They're observables. And then a total function is just the sum, right? Is the sum of the two values. That's all it is. Now, the items themselves are standard Apex items, but I added under the custom attributes, I added that data bind with a text input binding to the name called value 1. And if I look at value 2, same thing for val 2. If I look at the total, it's also a data bind to my total variable. That's all it takes. That is all the code that it takes to make this happen and this total update. Now let me show you something interesting. Oh, let me check the questions. Yeah, will the code be made available is the question. Absolutely. You'll be able to download this application. You'll be able to look at this presentation, and you'll be able to look at this this demo here running the PL SQL. Okay, everything will be available. Let me show you something interesting. If I set a default value and I say 5, because that's my default value for val 1. Okay, I'm going to save it. I'm going to run it. And my 5 gets ignored, right? It gets completely ignored. And why is that? It gets ignored because my bindings are initializing with a value. Even if I don't initialize with a value, I'm going to remove the 0 from val 1. I'm just initializing to an empty value. That's it. But it's still, Knockout is initializing the HTML and taking over. Now it still works, right? It's just I didn't get my default. So let's talk about that default for a moment. First, as I was mentioning, if you're in Apex 5.1, you include the Knockout library by doing this reference. Otherwise, just go and download it from KnockoutJS. You download your library and you include it on your page. I show you this part, how we specify the code, the view model, and when the page loads, we apply bindings and it starts running. We apply the values and so on. All right, let's talk about that default problem. There's a plugin called Knockout pre-rendering plugin. It's a Knockout plugin, not an Apex plugin. It's a Knockout plugin. All we gotta do is go download it. I upload it to my application in my app images, and I inject it into my app. And we're gonna switch between our data binding that says just simply text input value 1. We're gonna add the word init. It's another binding command. And if we had a loop, they get a little more tricky, but there's going to be a for each init instead of the plain for each. So let's look at this pre-rendered example. So this one started with 15 and 5. If I edit this page, I go to value 1, and here's my default value is set to 15. This one is set to 5. How about we change it to 7, just so that we have no tricks. And let me show you our view model. I'm still starting them in 0, but thanks to the plugin, which I'm using right here, I'm just adding that library. So now we're going to get 15 and 7, right? There you go. it initialized to 7. And we can still make the changes. It's still fully functional. So this is exactly what we want for Apex, because in Apex is going to fetch the HTML with our initial values. At least a lot of the times, that's what we're going to do, right? We're going to fetch our data. Our HTML gets rendered with initial value. So this plugin is awesome for us in Apex because we can use whatever value was brought over with Apex and initialize our variables with that value. Here's the findings. We have some questions. Question is, what is the size limit for uploading files to Apex Images? Well, not really something specific to Knockout. Size limit, well, they're blobs, so they can be very large. I don't know the exact number, but they're very, very large. So it's not really a big concern. Although I do recommend you place code and things like that in your web server instead of app images. That's always a good idea. Another question, is it advisable to download and use a different Knockout version than what is provided in 5.1? Will it affect, for example, the use of OracleJET charts? Excellent question. So if you're on a page that's using Jet charts, you need to use the one included with Jet. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting a collision of Knockout library versions. Okay, they're both going to be called KO, and you'll just want to stay with the one that's provided. If you're using Knockout on a page that does not use Jet, then you don't have a problem. You can include any version that you want from Knockout. That said, both Jet and Knockout right now are in exactly the same version. Knockout is mature enough. Actually, in JavaScript terms, it's probably ancient, right? It's been around for a long time. And the version of, what was it, 3.4? Yeah, 3.40 is the current version, and it's very stable. So we're locking that it's not really going to change that much. Good question. All right, so we did the inits to initialize those values. We don't need an init for our total, right? That's still computed based on those two. So there's the pre-rendered. Now, if we have multiple elements, that gets a lot trickier. So let's see. Yeah, I'll cover this in a second. So we're gonna see the example using the for each init. Let me show you a more complex example here. I'm just gonna look at these three accessories. So we're using Knockout here. We have our products array. They have prices, 35, 120, and 50, and you can see the prices there. And we're just adding them all together. So if I add 100 here to 135, you can see how this changed, and you can see how this one changed. If I change this one, you can see them how they're changing, right? And we can see the total computed. So let's see how we're doing this. This is a little more complex example. I see we have another question. I'll get to that in a second. So I'm adding the pre-rendered. This is a more complex example in that we're specifying our product view model that has a name for the product and a price for the product. And for each view model, we have an array of products. Our total, here's what I was saying, that how we can loop. And notice how I'm using something called a pure computed. It's similar to the computed, but it's never going to get changed. It's a one-way computation, which is really what we're doing in this case. And what we're doing here is for each product, we're looping through them, and we're adding the price. So it doesn't matter how many products I have, I'm going to loop through the array, and I'm going to return the total. And whenever I create a new product, I call product view model. Anyway, but here's the tricky part. I'm going to go to my tabular form. Tabular forms happen to not, which is what I'm using here. It could have used Apex item. I'm using this trick that after the page refreshes or the first time it loads, I'm going to execute some JavaScript. And bear with me, this is kind of ugly code. I'm going to find my report body. I'm going to find my rows, and each of my rows, first at the container level, right? So the body, at the body, I'm going to have to add this data bind attribute. Why? Well, for items, we were able to add that data bind at the custom attribute level, but this report doesn't have a place for us to plug in this data bind, so we're adding it with jQuery. So with jQuery, I go and add my data bind. I add my for each to loop. I specify a template, and I specify my array of products. And then for each row, actually not for each row, the last row, I find the last row on the column of list price. I'm going to add my total. So that's what adds this, because again, I cannot plug in this field directly in Apex. I don't have a field for that. So this is my hack. I'm injecting my bind for the total. And then finally, I can initialize each of my rows. And for each row, I'm going to push it into the array. I'm looping through my rows. I just count how many rows I have in view model. I know it'll be easier if you are able to play with this and sit with the example and run it, but it's not that horrible. Let me go to the next one. It's a little more interesting. Now I have a list price and a quantity. So now I can say, let me restrict it to just accessories. I'm going to say 1 gives me a 35. And here's my total, which for some reason is not being injected here in the bottom. I have a little bug, but it was on the other page. Or if I do a 2, how I have a 70 for the total, or list total is 205 there. So I can have a 1 here and a 1 here. So you can see how this is now doing an operation of multiplying those two and computing this, and how I'm summing all of these into this total. It's a little more involved element. All right, I had another question about the interactive grid. Interestingly enough, the interactive grid is a very complex jQuery widget. It does not use Knockout. So I'm sorry, but the Knockout stuff will not help you with interactive grid. Yeah, it could be rewritten, but I don't think anyone wants to rewrite it yet. So back to previous answer, does Knockout have a non-conflict mode similar to jQuery? Very good question. For what I've seen, I don't think Knockout has a no conflict like jQuery does. Good question. We answered the interactive grid. Okay. Let's go back to this. So yeah, we did the trick of finding the body. We have to add the data binds manually in the places that don't exist. But hey, it's pretty cool. And we do this big demo. So let me show you one way at Insum we applied Knockout. This is our in-time system, we call it, for entering time. And what you're seeing in this grid, I'm going to run it live for you here. Let's make sure I'm still alive in this session. I am, great. So this is not an Apex tabular form. This is an interesting combination of Apex items, Apex buttons, and jQuery, sorry, a Knockout template and Knockout code. So if I enter vacation hours, so let's say I'm on vacation, as I enter the 8, you can see how my day gets updated, the total gets updated here, and the total gets updated over here. If I enter time into something else that requires a comment, I'm going to get a message that says a comment is required, and I need to edit here and enter new feature. I enter what it's about, and when I click save, it actually does an AJAX call to save it, and it's being saved. Every time I enter values, it's being saved. Now let me show you what's interesting. Because in Knockout I can switch templates, when I switch to day view, I'm just switching the template, grid and day. and I don't have to fetch data again. And here's the 4 hours I entered, and here's where I said new feature. So I can say new cool feature here. And if I switch again to my grid, when I open this, that still says new cool feature. And because this is all this data is represented in Knockout data model, I can search for things. So I can enter Apex, and then I find one. So as I type, I can find things, HTS or vacations. And we also implemented this drag and drop. So if the vacation is more important, I can put it in the top, things like that. So this is all driven by Knockout. Multiple templates, AJAX requests to save the data. There's no need for save buttons, and we can add multiple entries for a day and add the time and so on. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. I don't know if there's any more. We're almost out of time, 4 more minutes. Did you find this useful? Hopefully you can see where you can use some of this Knockout functionality already and maybe improve on some functionality. Hopefully you find new ways to use it. Send me a message, send me a tweet, tell me about what you've done. I had done this presentation at KSCOM. Somebody already was able to implement this dynamic sum of totals on some application they had. They did that right away, and all they used was this knowledge to apply it. Interesting question. So why use this instead of AngularJS? You know, on paper they do the same thing. However, Knockout is closer to Angular 1. In that Angular 1 is more like a library, and the problem with Angular 2 is that it wants to take over the whole functionality of everything. I don't know what it would take to make Angular 2 play nice with Apex. You almost have to build a whole page with Apex. See, in this example, it's still just an Apex page with Apex items, and when I click on something here, I get the standard model from Apex. If I click on these elements, I get standard model from Apex. So there's things that I don't know how well they will work with Angular 2. But yeah, you could use Angular. It's kind of equivalent. Or Vue, which I heard is a little more elegant to use. That said, I decided on Knockout because it's already something that I'm going to have to learn better to use JET and its integration with Apex. That's where I saw the value of spending time on it. Can you please suggest some more sources for further to explore? All right, so do download here from GitHub. Rimblas, you'll find this presentation. You'll find the presentations here in the blog. For more resources, I think KnockoutJS.com is excellent. Really, KnockoutJS.com has a fabulous tutorial. This is a great tutorial where you're going to learn a lot and very simple to use. And the documentation is very, very good. You have all the bindings, the CSS binding, the for each, the ifs, the nots. There's lots of different things. How is this different from React? You know, on paper, this is not that much different from React. React is the same type of approach, but similar to Angular 2, React also wants to sort of take over. There's a lot of framework components to them. Now, I'm talking without all detailed experience. I think they're all similar on paper. So you can read a lot about them. And actually, a lot of people bash Knockout because it's very old. But just because it's very old, I don't see anything wrong with that. For enterprise applications that we're building, I think it just gives a lot of stability. That's why Microsoft and Oracle decided on it. Another question is that I used the tabular form. It says, you use a tabular form for the demo. Will this work similar to the interactive grid? No, the problem with interactive grid is that it's its own whole widget, jQuery widget monster. So you almost have to write all different code. So no, I think it would be very complex to use one or the other. I don't think there's good opportunities with the interactive grid. Okay, one more. Can we add a data valid message? Yeah. So actually, that's part of what we do right here, right? I don't know if this is what your question is, but when I enter something, this message is an attribute in Knockout that says the error is true, and I have an error message, and I display with CSS. And once I enter a comment, that error gets turned off to false. So yeah, you can. It's not a data valid, but it's more like I'm controlling my own errors with a computed value that is an error, true or false. Hope that helps. Is this a reason to keep the? Oh, so this is a reason to keep the legacy tabular form around? Absolutely. I like that. And actually, let me say something. It looks like a tabular form. This is a custom coded HTML page, so it's actually not even a tabular form. It just looks like what it would be an Apex tabular. So it really depends on your use case. This is more of a full Knockout application. Well, we're out of time. Thank you, everyone. But hey, if you have a few more questions, I'll stick around for a few more minutes. Keep shooting. But everybody else, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you found this useful, entertaining, and helpful. We'll see you at the next Kscope series of presentations.